The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to today's TriStar sponsored webinar. I'm Scott Pearson. I'm the marketing coordinator here at TriStar. Today we have with us application engineer Shawn Schreckengost, who will be discussing reference selection, best practices, and advanced reference selection. This webinar will be recorded and posted to the TriStar Resource Center, which can be reached by going to tristar.com and clicking the Resource Center link at the top right of the page. Unfortunately, we will not have time to answer questions today, so please email or call your local TriStar representative to get questions answered after this presentation is done. And with that, I'll hand things over to Shawn. Shawn?
Thank you, Scott. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to TriStar's exclusive webinar about Creo Parametric 3, and reference selection best practices and advanced reference selection. What I want to talk about today are a few things. First of all, I want to discuss the difference between feature number and feature IDs so that everybody understands why feature IDs jump in great numbers and, of course, what's the difference between them. And then we're going to get into how to know what you are selecting references, better reference selection methods, selecting references from lists, and also rule-based reference selection. And then I have some config.pro options to help you understand what is being selected. So with that, these are the few slides that I have. We'll come back and talk about these in just a moment. But what I have on my screen right now is a brand new part that I created. It's just a default part with a default start part, or template, if you will. And I'm going to create a very simple feature. So I'm going to select my front and datum plane as my sketching plane, and I'm going to create a simple extrude by sketching a rectangle, and I'll use the equal lengths constraint, and we're just going to make this a simple 10-inch by 10-inch square, and then we're going to extrude that to also the depth of 10 inches. Okay. And then what I want to do is I'm going to turn this into a wireframe so that we can see, the lines in the back, the lines in the front. Perhaps note or hidden lines might be better. And I'm also going to turn on in my tree columns the feature number and the feature ID. Okay. And then we're going to just talk a little bit about what these numbers mean in our model tree. So what you'll notice is with the feature number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that is basically the sequence of features in the model. And then the feature ID is the unique identifier for each of these features, so 1, 3, 5, 7, and 40. Now the difference being is the feature number is the sequence and the feature ID being the unique identifier. ProEngineer or Creo Parametric will never reuse feature IDs. What I mean by that is if I were to delete this feature, feature number 5, ID 40, and then recreate it in the same manner, selecting the front datum plane as my sketching plane, extruding a rectangle, we'll make the same square, equal lengths, we'll say it's 10 inches, and then we'll extrude it to a depth of 10 as well. What you'll notice is that Creo Parametric gave it feature number 5 again, but the ID has changed. So we need to understand why does that ID change, and also why does it jump in such great numbers? Well, if you think about it, this simple feature, extrude number 1, feature number 5, feature ID 67, is really made up of 6 surfaces, 12 edges, 24 vertices, and then there's a few things that we can't see. But these all get a unique ID. Well, how can we be so sure? Well, we need to turn on a config.pro option that allows us to see those IDs. So if I go to File, Options, Configuration Editor, and I'm going to add a config.pro option that says show selected item ID, just like that. The default is set to no. We'll set that to yes. And say OK and OK. And I'm not going to bother saving this. But now what you'll see is that as I put my cursor over these items and I select something, the actual ID shows up in the tag window. So you'll see that that surface is feature ID 84. That edge is ID 87. This edge on the back here is ID 73. So that's an important thing to remember when you're selecting references. It's not that Pro Engineer or Creo Parametric sees that as a straight edge. It just looks for the ID. It doesn't care if it's a circular ID or a spline or a straight edge. It just cares that it has an ID associated to it. So as we create our models and we're selecting references, so for example, if I select a round and I select that edge there, it's assigning that round to the ID of 85. Okay, again, it doesn't care that that edge is straight or curved or spline. It just cares that it has an ID. Okay? Now, as we create our models, we also have to understand that we're actually creating an instruction list for Pro Engineer or Creo Parametric to build this model. So if I go in here to my Tools tab, and under Model Intent, if I show the program for this model, we'll just show the design, you can see that this is basically an instruction list on how Pro Engineer builds this model. So we'll see we're using Creo Parametric version 3, rev number 184. We're in this part, PRT001, and there's some input and end input sections. There's relations. If we had any relations, we would see them here. But then we see the individual features and the elements of those features. So for example, feature number 1 has an ID of number 1. It's a datum plane. These are the elements of that feature. Its name is right, and it resides on these layers. And then we see this end add. So that's the first feature, that datum plane right. We'll scroll down a little bit. We'll see the second feature. Its ID is 3. It's also a datum plane. Its name is top, and we're ending that feature. And then if we scroll down further, we can see the other datum planes and the coordinate systems. But then when we get to this feature number 5, we can see that it is an extruded protrusion. Again, these are the elements that make up that feature. It has a cross section inside of it. And again, it has some dimensions, and that's the end of that feature. And then finally, we have that feature number 6, which is a round. Its ID is 94. And so on. So as you're building your models, you have to think that you're building this instruction list on how Pro Engineer or Creo Parametric will build the model. So the better we are at selecting our references, the easier it is for Pro Engineer or Creo Parametric to build this model. I'm going to go ahead and delete this round just so that we can do it again. Okay. Now the common mistake that a lot of users make is that they'll create a round, and it's always a good idea to maybe specify your round value before you select. But we'll select one reference and hold the control key down, and we'll select multiple references. Okay? Now, although that works, it works really well, what's happening here is we're recording 4 IDs in that round feature. And all it requires for that round to fail is just one of those IDs to be missing. Okay? So if we make a change to the sketch, for example, that round's going to fail. So I take this feature and I edit its definition, and I edit the internal sketch, and I start to delete some geometry, I get an error saying that these items are referenced by other features, and therefore that round is going to fail if I resume this feature after making these changes. Okay? So that round has actually failed. Okay? And if we go into the round and edit its definition, we can see that under sets, the reason why it's failed is because there are some references that are missing. Okay? So I'll quit this edit definition. I'm going to back up a little bit. And let's talk about these references. Here again, I've got an ID that's associated to these edges. That's ID 87, that's ID 85, ID 83, and so on. Okay? One thing I want to point out is the surface is ID 75. Now that surface is determined by my depth option through the extrude. So if I were to come in here and make that same change to this feature, we'll edit the sketch. We'll delete these two items again. Now they're not referenced by anything, so it's not going to give us an error. And we'll create a new line, just like we did before, and extrude that. What we'll see is that these edges get a new ID, right? Remember, ProEngineer will never use the same ID twice. Okay, if we delete something and create it exactly the same, it will change the ID. Except for, in this option, the depth. Remember the depth before was ID 75? Well, because we didn't change our depth option, that ID remains the same. So understanding how these IDs work is very important because ProEngineer, Creo Parametric, is actually recording those IDs as references as we build the model. Okay, so let's back up again here. And what I want to do is I want to show you a better way of selecting. Okay, so when I create that round, again, it's a good idea to always specify your value before you select because sometimes if your round value is set too high, it'll try to create the round, although it'll fail because some of the geometry cannot be created. So just as a rule of thumb, just set your value before you select any references. And what I'm going to do is rather than pick using the control key, I'm going to use my right side mouse button and I'm going to say pick from list. And basically what we're seeing in this list is everything that is behind my cursor where I selected. So we see the edge. We also see some surfaces that were behind my cursor. But what I want to point out here is this intent edge, right? And notice what's highlighted on my screen. All of the sharp edges that were created through the extrude are being selected. Now that makes it more robust by selecting those, right? Because I get all my rounds in one selection. And the best part about this is if I were to change that cross-section again, and I'm doing this the same exact way, and I delete these pieces of geometry, what you'll notice that I don't get an error, and when I recreate the geometry and recreate the extrude, I still get the round. It really doesn't matter what I do to that cross-section, my round is still going to be created. Okay, so if I come back in here and we'll undo that change, I'll add some more geometry to that cross-section. And let's go to the sketch view in this case, and I'll just create a rectangle here, something like that. And then we'll delete the parts of this that we don't want. And we'll continue with that extrude. You'll see that all of those sharp edges still have the round associated to them. So that's a method of selecting that we call intent selection. And it's a very powerful tool because it helps our models from failing due to missing references. Because that intent selection is really a collector, but it also has an ID associated to it. Okay? But that ID will never change because it's not associated to any physical geometry. Okay? Now, I often get the question when I show this demonstration, well, what if I didn't want all of those edges to have a round? Well, I can simply come in here and select that individual surface, and under editing, I can remove that surface and therefore missing that one edge for the round. I have no way to use intent selection and not pick all of those edges, okay? But I can always come in after the fact and perhaps delete the surface that's associated to it. I also get the question, well, what if I want one of those rounds to be a little bit larger? Well, rather than deleting, say, that surface, what I can do is create the round, and instead of selecting an edge, I can always select one surface and hold my control key and select another surface, and there I get a large round. So as long as that round doesn't become smaller, I'm okay. All right? So that intent selection is very powerful in that it gives me those options, and then after the fact I can always remove some surfaces or recreate a round over top one of those edges. Okay? Now I'm going to back up again here because I want to point out that when we use that intent selection, it's going to vary based on what type of feature we're creating, as well as what we're selecting or what we're putting our cursor on. So if I say create a round again, and rather than picking the edge created in the extrude, I can create the edge at the surface, and I'll say pick from list. And you'll see that, again, I have an edge, some surfaces, but I also have the intent edge, which is all 4 of those edges at the end of the extrude. So if we say OK, we're good to go. Again, if I take that feature and edit its definition and edit the internal sketch, and we'll delete these 2 pieces of geometry, recreate some geometry, I'm still going to get a round at the end of that feature because that's what I told it to do. I said collect all of the edges at that surface using intent selection. Okay. So this method of selection, again, is going to make your models much more robust and avoid failures. And typically it's the rounds that are going to fail the most. Okay. So that being said, I want to go to a different model here, and we're going to show you some other ways that intent selection works. So I'm going to close this model, and this is a model that I use a lot to show customers how to create rounds. So we'll be creating a few rounds here, but we're going to use some different selection methods. But before I do that, I want to kind of back up a little bit here and just show these features. Now what we have here is we have this extruded protrusion, which if we do an edit definition, we can see the cross section on that. So I basically have this shape extruded. And then I have another protrusion, which is this feature here, protrusion extruded. I have a couple curves. We'll come back to those. And I also have this chamfer. Okay. Now, of course, we can take a look at the feature ID and the feature number with these. Okay. And we can see that in this case, because we have so many features, that they're jumping in great numbers for the IDs. But again, the sequence or the feature number is 1 through 9 in this case, and because we have these others suppressed, we're not able to see them. But notice again, the feature IDs are jumping in great numbers. Now, let's just talk about a datum plane real quick. A datum plane is always going to jump by 2 numbers in the feature ID. And the reason for that is a datum plane has a positive side and a negative side. So it has 2 IDs. Datum planes are infinite in space, so there is no other element of that datum plane to assign an ID to. So a datum plane will always have 2 IDs. Again, it's the positive and the negative side. So I'm going to go ahead and create another round here. I'll specify my value. In this case, we'll say 0.1, I think is a good number. We'll say 0.25. How's that? And I'm going to select this edge right here. Now what you'll notice here is that by selecting that edge, which has an ID associated to it, 1123, it's following the tangencies all around that feature. Now, I'll come back and we'll talk about why it follows those tangencies in a few moments here, but I want to just kind of focus on that ID that we selected, 1123, and we'll create that round. And then what I'm going to do next is I'm going to delete some entities in the cross-section. And as I delete these entities, we won't get an error for these entities because they were not selected as a reference for creating the round. But if I select this edge, it was selected as a reference, and therefore we get this error. Okay, it says this feature or this entity is referenced by another feature. So I'm not going to continue here. What I can always do is if I have to delete some entities from a cross-section and I don't want my features that reference it to fail, I can create some other geometry here. And then if I pick on that entity that is referenced by other features and use my right side mouse button, you'll see replace. And I can always select something to replace it. And it's just saying it cannot replace align dimensions. Do we want to delete dimensions? That's fine. But by doing that and doing the replace, my round still gets created. All right, so that's a way to avoid that error in creating the round. But I'm going to back up again, and we're going to show some other selection methods again. So I'll create the round. I'll make sure my value is set first. I'm going to put my cursor here, and I'm going to say pick from list. And then what you'll see in this case is we have an edge again that we had selected. We have the two surfaces, but we also have two intent edges. And if we highlight the model, you'll see that they both look the same, but there is a slight difference between them. One of them says create a round or select the references, the edges that are created by one feature intersecting the part, and the other one might be one feature intersecting another feature. Okay, but they look the same in this case. So how do we tell the difference? Well, there is another config.pro option that we need to turn on. Okay, so I'll go to File, Options, Config Editor, and this one that we're going to add is called Provide Pick Message Always. The default is set to no. We're going to set that to yes. Now again, this is Provide Pick Message Always. Okay. We're going to set that to yes, and of course because this is a message, it's going to show up down here in our message window. So just keep that in mind of where we're going to get this information. I'm not going to save my config.pro, but watch what happens now when I create that round and I go pick from list, and we say picking that first intent edge, and we'll look down in our message area, and the first one says showing intent chain, feature 6 intersecting the part created by feature 6 and model references. Okay, the next one says showing side or intent chain from side surfaces of feature 6 intersecting side surfaces of feature 5. So there's a difference. I'm going to go ahead and use this one, which says feature intersecting feature. My round gets created, and then I'm going to take this feature and we'll edit it, and we're just going to drag this up onto the shelf here. And what you'll notice in doing this is that because I said feature intersecting feature, that the round does not get created on this chamfer because it's a different feature. So we said feature number 6 intersecting feature number 5. All of those edges get selected and the round gets created. Okay, so maybe not what I wanted in this case, so we're going to just back up a little bit. We'll undo that, we'll undo that, we'll undo the round. In this case, we'll create the round, and we're going to say pick from list again, and we're going to use the first option, which says create the round with feature 6 intersecting the part. So wherever that feature intersects the part, we should get a round. I'll take that, we're going to edit again, and we're just going to drag this up on the ledge there, and now you'll see that we get the round created on that chamfer. Right. So very powerful methods for creating rounds or selecting references. So I'm going to back up a little bit again here. And we'll go ahead and edit this feature. So I'll say edit definition. I'm going to edit the internal sketch. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and delete these entities again. And even though I selected this edge as my intent seed, I can delete it without getting an error, because any entity that I create is really part of that intent chain. So just by doing that with the geometry, I get a round. Now I said create a round everywhere feature number 6 intersects the part. Okay? So it's very hard now to make that round fail in this case. If I say edit, and I drag this up onto the ledge here, I get all of those rounds. Okay? Or if I say edit the definition, and I change the depth option to say symmetric perhaps, and I drag that feature out both sides of the model, of course, again, because I said create the round everywhere that feature intersects the part, I get a round now on both sides of that model. And finally, we'll do this one more time. We'll take this feature and we'll edit it, and I'm going to drag this edge off the end of the model again, and there we can see that we get a round all the way around that feature intersecting the part. Okay, so I could try as hard as I could to make this round fail, but it would be very difficult at this point because of the robust method that I used to select the references. Okay, so let's back up again. We're going to go back to the original feature here. And let's create some more rounds. I'm going to leave it just like that. And actually, we'll get rid of that last round, and we'll resume all these other features. Okay, so let's create some rounds here, and we'll talk about some other reference selection methods. So first of all, when we create a round, and we want to create a round on this surface, but we want maybe all those edges, we can use what's called a rule-based selection. So if I go to Details under my Sets tab, now what you'll see is under a lot of features, under the References tab or the Sets tab for rounds and chamfers and so on, is you'll see this Details option. And if I bring that up, we can see that the reference selection is set to standard. But if we use the rule-based option, what you'll notice is that the first rule is tangent. And that's why when I select that edge, all of the tangencies get selected. Okay? But what if I want a partial loop, right? Let's cancel this. We'll go back to the details, and I'll say rule-based and partial loop. Maybe I want to select from this edge to this edge and everything in between. So in this case, you'll notice that I've selected two IDs, ID 50 and ID 44, and then I have this option to flip the selection between them. This is a partial loop, so I've got one entity, two entities, and then everything in between. But I want the other side, so we'll just flip that and create the round. Okay? Now keep in mind that I did select two entities that have IDs. So those IDs will need to be intact for that round to be created. But I can do anything to this feature in between. Say, for example, I take that chamfer, which has the edge here on the end, and I delete that chamfer, right? My round is not going to fail because I said create the round using a partial loop between these two entities on the ends, all right? So another robust method for creating the round, okay, and for selecting those references. Well, let's undo that feature again. We'll just undo the round, and let's show the next method. We'll create the round. We'll go to Sets. We're going to go to Details. We're going to use the rule-based option, and we'll say Complete Loop. Now, in this case, I need to select a base entity and the seed surface, right? And by doing that, I have two IDs. I have the edge is 43 and the surface is 42. And we can say OK. Now this round will remain intact as long as that one edge that I selected as my seed reference stays intact. Remember, the surface in this case was created by virtue of the sketching plane, and therefore that surface will never change its ID. So it's this edge that I'm tied to and needs to be intact in the model for that round to be created. Okay? So again, some very powerful reference selection tools for selecting your references, and most importantly when creating rounds. Okay? Now let's talk a little bit about some other round options here, and we'll do a little bit of a advanced round session here. When we talk about advanced rounds, we're really talking about multiple reference sets within the same round feature. So for example, if I select this edge and I give it a round value, and I create a new set and I select another edge and I give it its own value, and let's create a third set and we'll select another edge and create a round. In doing this, although I could create those rounds as separate features, by creating them as a single feature, I now have the option to manage the transitions of the round. Okay, so if I go to my transitions icon here, and I can select that round transition, and I have options on how I want those rounds to intersect. The first one is the default using round 2's value, or we can say intersect, which basically gives me kind of a sharp edge, if you will, all the rounds converging together. Or I can say a corner sphere. You can think of this as, you know, the largest value round and every other round kind of transitioning to that value. And then finally the last one would be round 1 only. So those are your different options that you have when managing your transitions by selecting each of those references as an individual round set. Okay, so we have some nice options as far as controlling how we want that round to look. And what you'll also notice is that I have transitions on the ends of these rounds as well. And what's that for is if maybe I want to stop that round at a certain location. So say, for example, we create a datum point on the edge of that round. Right? And I'll put a datum point right there. We'll come back to the round. We'll be in our transitions. I can select that transition and tell it to stop at a reference. Okay? And that round gets stopped right at that reference. So that comes in handy if you have some difficult geometry, perhaps. You can't necessarily create the round all the way to the edge. Maybe we might have to come in here and do some surface operations to get the geometry that we want. We can always stop that round. Or maybe I want to put another round on this edge here that might be a little bit smaller. I can do that as well. Okay? So that, again, that's using transitions. I'm going to go ahead and back out of this again. We'll undo. And I'm going to create another round on this edge. So if I create that round there and I make that larger, what you'll notice is that it has trouble creating that round through the entire part. Well, what that is it's only creating the round on that edge that I selected. But if I want to, I can go to Transitions, and I can select this transition, and I can use the stop case 2, which takes that round and carries it all the way to the edge. And I can do the same on that transition and say stop case 1. All right? Now that's the way to get that round to go all the way down the part, rather than what I've seen some people do in this situation is they'll just create an extrude with that circular cross section to remove material. Okay, but you don't have to do that. You can create it as a round still and just use those transitions to stop on each end of the round. Okay, so let's back out of this. And then let's talk about some other round options here, just so that we can cover a little bit of options that we have for creating rounds. if I create a round and I select this edge, for example, I don't have to give it a value. I can actually use a curve that's on the model to specify the radius value. So you can do some pretty neat things by using curves to specify your values. Again, I'll do it here on this edge. We'll select that edge. I can always create rounds by selecting the edge first. If I use my right side mouse button, I've got rounds in the menu. So that's another way to create a round. And we'll say under sets, we're going to say through curve again, and we'll select that curve. And there you can see we can create some really neat shapes by using curves. Okay? The only thing that it doesn't like when you're using curves is sharp corners. So just keep that in mind, that you have to have some smooth transition on your corners. Okay? Now let's talk about some more options for using a round through a curve. Say, for example, I want to put a round on this edge here, and I want it to go through the edge. Rather than specifying a value, I can say under sets, we'll go through the curve again, and we'll select that curve. Okay? And what's nice about that is if I change the shape of this feature and make it a little bit larger, that round will not fail because it's based on the geometry of the feature. Let's do that again here. In this case, we have a little bit of an offset. And if I create that round and I select this edge here, and then I say I want the value to be defined by this curve, and there's the round. Okay? So again, we can do some pretty neat stuff. Okay. I'm going to undo that one. We're going to create another round. In this case, I'm going to select this edge to put the round on, and then I'm going to say through curve and select this edge. Now you notice that that round is not being created because it can't follow that edge all the way around. So sometimes you may have to hold your shift key down and pick another edge to continue that curve. All right, so again, I'm holding the shift key down to do that, and that's the end result, is that neat little round on the end of that stud. Okay? Now let's put a round on this edge here. I want to show you the difference between the rolling ball and the normal to spine option for creating a round. So again, I'll create a round. My value is 0.25. I'm going to select that edge right there, and you'll notice that Creo Parametric is trying to create the round, but it just can't quite create it sometimes. All right, in this case, it was able to, but not necessarily liking what I'm seeing. So we have the option here to say, instead of a rolling ball, we can say normal to spine. And that creates a little bit better round in those situations. Okay, so sometimes if you have that odd geometry, it's a spline type edge, and it can't create the round, come up here and try going normal to spine rather than using the rolling ball option. Okay, so let's undo that again, and I'm just going to back up my model to right about here, I think. And let's show you another selection method. Now this is not for necessarily selecting edges for creating rounds, but this is what we call a seed surface selection. And I wanted to show you this because of the options that are available to us. So for example, if I select on this end surface, and I want to select all of this geometry that makes up those features, I can select that surface. And if I hold my shift key down and I select this surface, it'll select everything between the seed surface and the extent of this surface, right? And we can see that all of that gets selected, right? So that's a great way for, selecting cavities in a model. For example, I want to, highlight all that geometry with one selection. So again, I'll do that by selecting that surface first. I'm going to hold my shift key down, and then I'll select that surface there. And there, as you see it, we have all of that geometry selected. Okay? Let's try that again on this feature here and see what we get. I'll select that top surface, and then we'll hold the shift key down and select that surface. And you see all those connected surfaces between the seed surface and the boundary get selected. Okay. And then finally, let's talk about some other round options that we have as far as creating variable radius rounds. Now, when we create a round, we get one radius by default, but if I put my cursor over this little dot here and I say I want to add a radius, it'll put a radius at each end that I can now vary from one end to the next. If I want more round values through this, I just have to go to my sets option, and if I put my cursor down here in this area, I can add another radius that is located using what we call a length ratio, right? So if I put it at 0.5, that's half the distance along the edge or reference that's selected, and then I can specify an individual radius value for that as well. So you can get some pretty neat rounds by creating the variable radius round. Now finally, let's take a look at this chordal option. What the chordal round does for me is, let's create a round on this edge as well. So we'll say create a round, and I'm going to pick, let's just change our value a little bit first. I'm going to say 0.1, and we'll select that edge. And then I'm going to go to my sets, and I'm going to say chordal. What chordal says is that that value is going to be constant regardless of the tangencies of those surfaces. So this is a neat way to get around into some tight situations that you want to have this constant chordal length. Now this is only available with Creo 3, the chordal round, but everything else I've shown you today has been available with Creo Parametric 2, Creo Parametric 1, all the wildfire builds, and back to version 2001 and before. Okay? So with that, that concludes our webinar today on advanced reference selection and selection best practices. You may want to jot down these config.pro options. Again, that was show selected item ID, and I think it's selected, I'm sorry, got a little typo here. Show selected item ID and provide pick message always, and set that to yes. Okay? And if you do that, you don't even need to go to the pick from list, for example. Again, I'll create a round. If I put my cursor here, that's going to use the rule-based. Right-click once, pick from list, I get my intent selections. Or if I just use my right side mouse button, you'll notice that it toggles through those selections. So you can get pretty good creating that round and just using your right side mouse button to toggle through your selections. You don't even have to go to the list, right? And accept. Okay? So again, those config options are very important for you to understand what you're selecting. Always know what you're selecting. Be very careful not to select references in a method that may cause your model to fail. You always have a better way to select. And if you keep that in mind, you'll find that your models are much more robust and less prone to failure. So with that, I want to thank everybody for attending today, and I look forward to maybe seeing you on another call in the future. We have a few more calls and webinars in this series, and we'll hope to see you there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shawn, and please check out our upcoming webcasts at tristar.com/events. Everybody have a great week. Thank you.